Welcome back to All Together Here. Our next session is entitled Forgotten No More, and it is led by Dr. Jody Skipper. Dr. Skipper is an applied anthropologist who explores the representation of African American lives through material culture, and she's currently a professor, an associate professor of anthropology and Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi. Welcome, Dr. Skipper.
Thank you so much for the welcome, Laura, and welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this session. Again, my name is Jody Skipper, and as Laura said, I'm on the faculty in Anthropology and Southern Studies at the University of Mississippi. There, I work with homeowners to interpret slave dwelling sites on their private properties. I also work with that local community to think about how those interpretations of slavery impact us in the present. I was one of Dr. Maria Franklin's archaeology students and also worked with Hicks & Company as a student while in Austin. So it's nice to virtually see so many familiar faces from a distance. It's also really nice to be introduced to so many new people, including the following panelists doing such extraordinary work in Austin. Our first panelist is Dr. R.O. Smith, a librarian and historian who currently serves as Secretary of Save Austin Cemeteries. Our second panelist is Jennifer Chenoweth, who curates the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel for the Museums and Cultural Programs Division for the City of Austin. Our third panelist is Reverend Rev Horton, who serves as youth pastor and assistant to Pastor G.V. Clark at Mount Zion Baptist Church. Our final panelist is Maria Solis, a member of the Tejano Genealogy Society of Austin and its current president. Today, they will help us to think about memorialization. My first question is, how accessible is the work happening at Oakwood Cemetery to the rest of Austin? What do they know about it? And I'll actually ask if maybe Jennifer could get us started here.
Sure, thank you, Dr. Skipper. It's a pleasure to be here. One of the things we attempted to do at the Oakwood Chapel is make all of our research and programming digital and published for posterity, even going back and updating things as we learn new information. So I know that not everyone has access to technology, but right now, especially while people can't go out to the world to do research at the Austin History Center in person or such, you could still visit the cemetery, which is a really beautiful and peaceful place to be, and follow some of our research and tours online. We've spent the majority of our quarterly exhibitions researching undertold stories. The first one we did, I got to collaborate with Rev Horton on a program called To Believe, where we looked at the legacy of Reverend Jacob Fontaine and how he established, after he was freed from slavery at age 57, the St. John community, 6 Black Baptist churches, which are still in existence, and his legacy of faith on Austin. Our next exhibit, I got to work with Maria Solis and the Tejano Genealogy Society on Caminar. All of those exhibits and the ones we have done since, we do our best to focus on the stories we haven't researched as well, because our fantastic friends group, Save Austin Cemeteries, has done a lot of research over decades. Their work is online too. So we're trying to merge all of that history of Austin and make it very available to the public. If you've seen in some of the previous symposiums, Greg Farrar, one of my employees, is a descendant of the cemetery. And we've spent hundreds and thousands of hours between Save Austin Cemeteries and our chapel staff researching and making that available to the public, both digitally as well as finding records that hadn't been found before.
Great, thanks so much for that, Jennifer. And I'll just open up this next question to all. What kinds of events would be appropriate to commemorate the individuals discovered at the Oakwood Cemetery?
that a question for me or everybody?
Well, that's for everyone, but if I'll just point out Aro if he's okay answering this.
I'll start the conversation.
Okay.
You know, Save Austin Cemeteries, one of our goals is to get the community into the cemetery so that the community will be interested in preserving the cemetery. And for many years, we have invited the community twice a year to tours, one surrounding Texas Independence Day, and then another usually at the end of October. And these are fun ways to get the community in. I think that going forward, all of our tours kind of center around the chapel. And I think going forward, you know, part of what we will do is, as part of our educational tours, is to talk about the renovation of the chapel and what we discovered while renovating the chapel. There's a new we've always known that there were many unknowns in Oakwood Cemetery, and now we have a concrete example of the unknown. And going forward, I think, you know, what we can try to do is talk about how we memorialize and what happens when we stop memorializing, what happens when we have forgotten people. And now that we've rediscovered people, what's the story now? And so the fact that the chapel is the center of kind of the public aspects of Oakwood, it lends itself to this new story, a new chapter in the story.
Thank you, Oro. Reverend Horton, what type of community events would you like to see? Same question.
Thank you, Dr. Skipper. So great to be here with each of you. I think one of the things that we could do is the chapel represents to us an amazing partnership between city government and the faith community. And so I think it would be very appropriate if we had some type of event where we honored the life of those that have been discovered. Not so much that we have to do a new funeral for them, but even if there was something that allowed people to embrace the spiritual part of their lives and to officially, you know, inter these individuals and to bring faith and community together. I think it would just be so important, especially in the times that we're living in right now, where the very building, the very entity that once covered and hid these individuals would now be the same place that actually allows them to be seen and visible to the community and honors their lives. So I would love to see something that brings religion and faith and all of those together in honoring those persons that we've discovered.
Thank you so much for that, Reverend Horton. And also just a reminder for those who would like to ask questions, please put those questions in the Q&A. I would also like to hear from Maria Solis on this. Can you please tell us what you'd envision in terms of thinking about commemorative efforts?
Yes. I think that before we can start planning events, we have to tell the story of the people, whether they have headstones or names or not. We have to tell the story of the people that are there or the groups of people. Many of the Mexican Americans, Jennifer had a procession for our group, and we walked throughout the cemetery calling out the names of the people that were buried there. And in some cases, we just called out Mexican baby girl or Mexican female, Mexican male, because there were no names attached to them. So first, before we can plan events, we need to write the story of what happened. Why are they there? And we need to be honest and truthful about that story, because it is from that storytelling that we can learn and we can go forward. And then once we get there, then we could start planning events. And I think as far as events are concerned, there are a lot of events that are important to the Mexican American community. So I think it would be a community effort, you know, talking to community leaders in the Mexican American area as to what events they would like to see take place. We need to find out whether some of the current Austin residents have ancestors buried there, and ask them, what would you like to do? How would you like to memorialize your ancestors in this cemetery? So I think it's first, let's tell the story, let's be honest, warts, everything off, and then we can go forward.
Thank you so much for that. And that's so important. Naming is so important. Telling these stories is so important. And one thing that we chatted a little bit about before we actually were brought into the session was this idea of incorporating younger people. And I'll actually open this up to anyone at first to think about how do we get younger people involved in helping us to tell these stories, as well as commemorating, as well as these memorialization and commemoration events. Jennifer, would you like to start there?
Sure. One of the things that we've tried to do is not everybody understands their stake in history. I know in my education, my understanding of history was pretty lacking, and it's been unbelievably satisfying to learn about that because of this job. And so I've tried to pair our exhibits with contemporary arts programming, performing arts, or literary arts. We've had some visual art exhibitions of film and photography. And that's been able to bring some younger people into the cemetery. And it's really satisfying to have us all astonished together at the history we didn't know of a city we all call home and are all very attached to, but really have very little understanding of the rich, diverse, and detailed history that the people buried there represent. It's not the big hero's story that you see at the Bullock, you know? It's the everyday people who literally built the Capitol building, like stonemasons and carpenters and wheelwrights, and it's been really moving. So I feel like Austin's had such a big population growth. A lot of those are younger people, and they want to call it home, but they don't have a way into history. So we hope that by doing contemporary cultural things paired with historic stories, that we will engage younger audiences in that way.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jennifer. And I know, Reverend Horton, with your experience as youth pastor, you have a lot of understanding about what it means to make particular things accessible to young people, and also to think about what their needs are. So can you speak to what you think might make this type of work more accessible and interesting to them?
Sure. I want to applaud Jennifer and her team for what they've already done with the digital maps and the ability to log into their website and just be able to do a virtual tour, because that's reaching where young people are, is using technology. But if I can speak particularly for me, one of the joys I think of helping to get our young people engaged is that Jennifer also mentioned the To Believe project, where we honored Reverend Jacob Fontaine. And so the church where I served is one of the churches that he founded. And so being able to take our young people to that cemetery and help them to understand that this is the person who actually founded our church, this is the person that we reference, and this is where he's laid to rest. And I think that that helps them to have a connection, not just to Mount Zion, but it gives them a greater connection to the community. And one of the things I think that's kind of an elephant in the room, I don't know about everybody else, but when I was young, hanging out at the cemetery was not something I was choosing to do. That's not a place that you go. And that's what I think is so cool about this, is that with the chapel being redone and with all the emphasis that's being placed there, we can help a whole new generation of people to understand that the cemetery is not just this scary place that people talk about during Halloween, but it's a place of legacy. It's a place of lineage. It's a place of honor. It's a place of learning where you've come from and the people upon whose shoulders you stand. And so I think the sky is the limit to how much we can teach our young people and how we can get them a better and understand their foundation stronger of where they are in the city of Austin.
Thanks for that, Reverend Horton, and same for you, Auro.
One of the things that Save Austin Cemeteries has done particularly well is recruit high school students, especially in the drama department, I think, to help with our tours. And I like to think that those volunteers that reenact elements from Texas history for our tours, maybe one or two are going to actually grow up and be historians. at different times, we've also offered like extra credit for different high school classes for coming to the tours and participating in the organization.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's helpful. You know, I mentioned earlier that I work with private homeowners who interpret slavery on their private properties, and my students are the main tour guides for that, and they are the tour guides for the K through 12 population. And it's so important because we know that the younger people are the ones responsible, or who will be responsible, for culturally transmitting this historical memory that we have. So it's really important to always think about how they're fully incorporated there. So thank you all so much for sharing on that. Another thing that I'm sure so many folks are interested in knowing is what are the considerations for permanent headstones, statues, or permanent signage at the cemetery, and how you all might be thinking through that. Jennifer, can you get us started there?
Sure. We know that once we find empty space, hopefully at Oakwood Cemetery through the archaeology project, that we will put headstones. So we've got a survey that we are asking our attendees and our stakeholders to respond to, with what information do they want on those headstones, since we don't know the name of the person. So how can we acknowledge them best? What materials, what style of stones that we will place for the 36 exhumed graves. There were 37 examined, one didn't have remains. So there are 36 individuals that we know a little bit of information about. Hopefully with DNA testing, we might know more. So how does the community want us to name them, speak about them? What is appropriate and what is honorable? We really want to revere them, not just name them. You know, we really want to set this right. Putting any new object in the cemetery is a challenge because as if you watched Greg Farrar's video, we have 2,700 burials in a space with roughly 300 headstones. So it looks like a green grassy field, but it is full of burials, and they did not keep maps at the time for the disenfranchised and people of color that they buried there. So we don't know exactly where, and we do want those people to rest in peace. So we don't want to dig much or far to find out if there's empty space or not. So headstones, yes, we want the public to tell us what they want, and my fellow panelists. Other types of monuments or memorials or activities is exactly what we're trying to talk about today. One of our speakers in the last session, Dr. Holloway, wrote this amazing book, Passed On, that I read when I first took this job, and I realized what a big job it would be. And the cover of that book has an artistic painting of a procession. And I think I would love to see some type of memorial events that included a procession when we can gather again. As part of that heritage and history, there's so much signage or interpretation or ways that we can make that place noticeable to out-of-town visitors and to the neighbors who come there every day, who don't know what that space is about. They just think it's an open park space. So.
Thanks, Jennifer. Aro, please.
You know, what I would, since we became aware of this problem, members of Save Austin Cemeteries have talked about how to solve the problem, and how to solve the problem of the physical bodies that were disturbed. And overall, two thoughts have come about, that each of these should be treated individually. They should be individually marked because they were buried individually. And the second thing is, we would like to see them reinterred and commemorated together, though, because this was one event that if we're all together here, we can do a couple of things. We can talk about the hard science that has given us information about these individual bodies. And we can talk about the social science of why they were forgotten, how they were forgotten. And so if we have them individually documented, it's also an opportunity to have a larger panel that talks about the chapel restoration project, the discovery, and the hard science that was used to find this, the details we know, and also the social science to talk about how it was that so many people in this area of the cemetery are unmarked and forgotten.
So, but I to add to that, in our pre-panel chat, we brought up the subject of the Tejano Monument. And if you go to the Capitol grounds and see the Tejano Monument, you will see that it's got 5 plaques, and each plaque tells an era of Texas history, and the Mexican American, the Spaniard, all the phases it went through, and it's very concise. So I think something, a plaque like that tells the history of the early Tejano in this area in Austin would be a great idea. It tells us, about when they got here, what their daily life was like, and just about some of the things that happened to them. So I think, and of course, along with the headstones, those that we have names for, and a list on one of those plaques or somewhere that list, in case we don't have a headstone, of how many people were found without names, if we know their ages, their sex, I think that would be a great idea. But I think the plaques, the ones at the Tejano Monument, are very concise. So a plaque that tells the history of the early Tejano in the Austin area.
Thank you. Reverend Horton, what would you like to see?
I'm in agreement with everything that I've heard. I like the idea of something concise, something that's respectful, something that's honoring, because I think, as Dr. Smith talked about, if we put that presentation together, it gives us such an avenue for so many different conversations. I'm thinking about our culture and our society, where we are now, and the divisiveness that we're in. And we really can't get past all of that until we get to a place of healing and restoration. And I think part of that is telling the story, as I've heard the other panelists talk about telling the story about how did we get here? How is it that these individuals were unmarked? How is it that the chapel happened to be built on top of their graves? How is it? I mean, you tell that story, and even though there's going to be some anger found in you telling that story, there may be even some regrets, there may be the gamut of emotions, but I think that once you honor that story and you own up to this is how we got here, then that gives us an opportunity to help our young people and others to know how do we move forward. And again, it helps us to understand that where we are today is nothing new, that this has been happening since the 19th century, that's why you have a section of the grave that was isolated for certain people. And so I just think it's such a learning environment when we do something like this, and we can't be afraid of the truth, allowing some people's egos and some people's histories as they understand it to become hurtful, because that's the truth of where we are. And so I love everything that they've suggested to this point. And as long as we're honoring those individuals and helping it tell a story and helping us to learn the history, I'm all for it.
Thank you so much for that, Reverend Horton. And that actually, your comment gets into my next point in question, which is thinking about healing and closure. I work with folks who interpret slavery. And when we started to do the work, one thing that we realized is that we had a serious gap in thinking about how slavery impacts us in the present. And fortunately, a few members of the local community decided to start a racial healing organization, just with a small group of people and some local college students to think through these issues. Because it's very difficult to reconcile what we consider these difficult past without thinking about what it's doing to us at the moment. And one thing that we started to do through that group is have a yearly libation ceremony at a cemetery where enslaved people and people as part of a sharecropper community were buried. At that cemetery, which is actually ought to have been preserved now, but was one of the largest rural plantations in North Mississippi. So we go there every year and we pour libation to our ancestors and we call our names, which is something that Maria Solis talked about, this idea of naming. So I'm really interested in thinking about how you think or imagine community events that would allow for this type of healing and closure that we need. Maria, can you start for us?
Yes, you know, we had a procession there with Jennifer, and I think that that's a good way of doing a yearly event. Another thing we might consider is, you know, seeing how the community feels is doing something for Dia de los Muertos, because that's when we get really spiritual. But what I do want to remind everybody is that the Spaniards came into Texas, they brought their people, they commingled with the indigenous population. And, you know, we have many different facets, many different people. You know, other Europeans came in and we mingled with them. So even though the Spaniards came here to bring Catholicism, the indigenous population, which is, you know, part of us, Tejanos, is they didn't quite have ceremonies that were Catholic. They were more of honoring Mother Earth. They had other spiritual ways of dealing with things during their lifetime. So I think that if we're going to have something like that, we have to honor the diversity of beliefs and faith and spiritualism for these people in our past, and have different ways of doing it. So it's not just one way, it has to be different ways to honor that. And it's not about how we feel now, but how they did things during their time.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak to that?
I was just going to say real quickly, I think Ms. Solis has it right. And I think somebody actually mentioned this in one of the questions that may be forthcoming. So I apologize if it's a spoiler alert. But in Austin, we're blessed to have several organizations that work in multi-faith traditions. And one of them, Interfaith Action of Central Texas, would be a wonderful organization to partner with, as we partnered with them with the To Believe project for the chapel. And so this would not be unfamiliar ground to try to do exactly what she's talking about, to honor the different faiths that would have been represented by those individuals.
Thank you. Jennifer, any thoughts there on healing and closure?
So many. Part of what we want to do is address those real truths and those uncomfortable truths, and have them be teaching tools for educators and young people. But what we also want to do is gather and grieve, and not only for the chapel burials, but for a lot of the loss we've experienced this year. So I would really love the input from the community on what kind of appropriate public ceremonies we could have in a 40-acre public space in Oakwood Cemetery. There's another 18 acres across that we could gather and grieve. I'm not the right person to lead that. I'm happy to collaborate and produce the events, but we need to understand grieving better, and we need to acknowledge our ancestors and our forebears, and acknowledge these people buried under the chapel, and all of these people buried in Austin, and all of the people we've lost this year. So I may be putting too much together, but I would really look forward to collaborating with the community on all the different cultural ways of remembering the past, all of our contemporary cultural ways of feeling all of our feelings, and doing that together to heal, so that we acknowledge each other's humanity and importance and how much we need each other.
Thank you. And Aro, how about you?
You know, I put on my sociologist hat, and I start thinking about the people that are currently forgotten. in our culture. You know, what happens today when someone without means dies and no family can be located? They are also forgotten. We have a whole segment of our community that is forgotten while they're still living. How can we make the remembrance of these forgotten people discovered underneath the chapel project? What can we do to remember, to think about, to create some sort of way to remember the people that we forget now? I don't know. And I am stretching far wider than the parameters of this project. I don't know. I don't know what the answers are here.
And it's important to remember that remembering and forgetting work in tandem. And those are processes that we always have to be aware of, certainly, yes.
I'd like to add something in respect to what Aro said right now, and that's it. In this times of COVID, we are experiencing that. We've had a lot of community leaders that have died, and we haven't had a chance to honor them or to grieve them because of COVID times and the restrictions we have upon our lives. So it is happening even now for a different reason.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thanks so much for that, for adding that. Yeah. I think that I have a unique experience of being an archaeologist who's also worked with other archaeologists to identify the graves of some of my ancestors in southern Louisiana. And the local priest, it's a majority Catholic community there, and the local priest, who was from Nigeria, wanted to bridge the gap between Africans and their descendants. So he led the charge to commemorate our ancestors. And it was just an invaluable means of support for us. And so given the diversity of individuals, what should be the role of spiritual or religious leaders? And this is something that Rev Horton was getting at earlier today, so I'll ask him to get started.
Sure. I think it's a place where, again, if there's any way that we can try to identify what faiths or what practices these individuals may have been a part of, I would imagine that those faiths are still represented in the city today. And so find a way to engage them in whatever we decide to do, whether it's one big, I think that would speak better volume if we were able to do one large thing with all those faiths represented together instead of everything in silos, because again, it just speaks continuously about division and how we're not doing things together as a community. But I think that would be one great way to do that is to just try to figure out best we can what faiths or what practices represent each of them, and then find those representatives today to do the same. And if I can piggyback very quickly on what Aro said, I really like that. And I don't think you're too far off, because I think that if you can figure out how do we remember those who have been forgotten in the past, then it helps us to figure out how to not forget the people now. And so again, it's still a learning moment for me that I think we can get valuable lessons from.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, if only our religious beliefs were stamped on our DNA. You know, one of the discussions that we had with Dr. Bolnick and Samantha Archer yesterday is the upcoming DNA analysis that is about to occur this fall. And so we can find out some things about the individuals. But unless we have a match, a DNA match that we can identify in a living person, then we can't actually put them together and make a match to identify who they were with any certainty. So one of the things that was mentioned at that discussion yesterday is that the researchers are going to make the opportunity available to people in Austin who had ancestors who lived in Austin during this time period. in the late 19th century, in the hopes that we can find a match. But, you know, there were two factors that may make it difficult. There's a high likelihood that these individuals were migrants or travelers to our area. And so they may have descendants or relatives in another state. We don't know. And we don't know if we can find them or if they can find our advertisement. The other is that as Austin has grown larger and larger and more gentrified, the families that might have been here last year or in the last decade have now moved to another community in Texas or in another state. So it becomes increasingly challenging as we grow as a city to find actual descendants that we can match DNA with. So that remains to be seen, how that will come about. But before we get too much further, I wanted to go over the suggestions that were put in the Q&A. One is, how about a multi-denominational cultural memorial? IACT, or the Interfaith Action of Central Texas, would be a great resource for that. And I think Dr. Horton was speaking of that. Another, school children used to visit Oakwood Cemetery, and programming can be used by teachers in class and then followed up by on-site visits to cement those connections. And I think Jennifer has done a little bit of that when we were open to the public, but I think certainly recent circumstances might create more opportunities for curriculum. Just pipe in if you have any comments about any of these. One person said, I love the proposed solutions to bring in the younger generations. How do you balance the cultural events to remain in line with respect for the cemeteries? Jennifer, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. We always give some information about etiquette when we're about to do an event or a tour. We have some rules about what you can and cannot do in the cemetery that we state over and over again with signage and in person. One of the things we talked about when we had a group of camp students, 4th to 8th graders visiting, is they were really uncomfortable about walking on the grounds. And that's a big question for adults too, but of course kids ask more direct questions, which is great. But we kind of talked about it. It's about your intention when you walk on the grounds. You may be walking over where people are buried, but it's about regarding them. It's about remembering them and kind of allowing you to feel that they're there. It's not that you can't step foot on the grass, but you shouldn't run around. You shouldn't sit on the monuments. You shouldn't throw balls for your dogs and hit the monuments. You shouldn't, you know, treat it like it's a place to party. You know, occasionally you get people showing up who are in a different state of mind, and we remind them that this is a place for peace. So there are lots of cultural things that we have done. With the Communar project, we had a dance group do a performance to honor the 4 directions, and we did it in the street. We didn't do it over graves, but a family might want to gather and do something nearby one of their family graves. Mm-hmm. So we try and think about place and etiquette and the how and the intention and the acknowledgement of that these were people and that one day we will be those people.
without loud amplified music or alcohol. If there is a DNA match, will we be allowed to inter the remains in our family plot in either Oakwood or the annex? Now, I'm not the person in charge of burials at Oakwood, but it would seem to me that you would have every right to claim your family member and reinter them in your family plot. The Save Austin Cemetery's suggestion for individual graves with headstones would probably be acceptable to our family. And that was a suggestion made by the same person who suggested that they reinter the remains in their family plot. Sidewalk chalking for events. Do you think a separate acknowledgement of each ethnic group interred would be good? How might you include within those the diversity of eras and faiths? Very good questions.
Laura, I'd just like to bring something up as far as the DNA is concerned. Many of us, especially in genealogy, have already had our DNA done. And many of us have input that data into the different databases, you know, like mine is on Ancestry.com, and it is also on GEDmatch. And these, you know, the data's already there. So I don't know what the constraints would be, you know, or would people sign off on when they contribute their DNA to those sites. But a lot of, especially if they're, you know, doing genealogy and they're from Austin, their database is already, their DNA database is already somewhere. It's just a matter of being matched up. And I know they're doing great strides with DNA matching, as we've seen in some TV shows lately, where they have been able to find or solve murders, you know, of years ago through some of those DNA sites. So I just wanted to remind that some already have their DNA in different databases.
You know, Laura,
Mm-hmm.
when you mentioned sidewalk chalk, I initially cringed because I don't know why I initially cringed. But now that I'm thinking about it, you know, so much of the problem that we have is because people like me think we have solutions. And wouldn't it be interesting to give children a spot on the sidewalk to create their own memorial for these forgotten people? What an interesting way to encourage new ideas about memorialization. I don't know. What I do know is that I need personally to be more open-minded to new ideas, not the same old ideas.
Someone pointed out that we have a blank canvas on the concrete wall on Navasota Street, and the master plan, which is online at Oakwood Cemetery Chapel's website, talked about a mural on this space. If you look at the master plan, it gives the public a bigger insight into the history of the cemetery, each of the cemeteries, and the approach to historic preservation and tourism. Another person said, whatever is decided, it's also important to have Austin History Center, Latinx, and African American archivists present, and we collaborate with them a lot. The DNA through the University of Connecticut may not likely use commercial sites because of privacy issues. So that's in answer to Maria's suggestion that we use commercial sites. So that's what we've got right now. I want to thank all of you for your assistance in thinking us through. We're going to continue to reach out and talk to the public as much as social media allows. And hopefully someday we'll be around a live table together to have these discussions. But for now, we're going to take a little 5-minute break before our next session. Our next session is called As It Unfolded, Transparency and Public Process. And so in this discussion that you will see at 3:35 in 5 minutes, the people who were most directly involved with the discovery with the from the staff side, from city staff side, will talk about the discovery of the burials beneath Oakwood Chapel, as it was a devastating event for the public as well as the staff. And so stick around. We'll be back in 5 minutes for that discussion. Thank you.